Welcome back to Reese's Side Quests. Hopefully today we have a little bit better quality video and audio. So for the current reading series that I'm doing, I've been reading Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin, and we've gotten through the first two chapters, so go check those out. But first you might want to watch this video because while I know you're probably waiting for Chapter 3, I realized that I actually skipped over reading the preface and introduction, so today's video is just going to be a short piece on that, and giving you a little bit of the important context for the rest of the work. And so, just a general primer on this, if you have no experience with this work, with Lenin, or with left-wing political philosophy and theory generally, is that this book was attempting to continue work upon the ideas of Karl Marx, where he, in the mid to late 1800s, had been analyzing this transition of capitalist economics in Western Europe into this proto-monopoly capitalism, and how the nature of how the capitalist system was being set up in connection with government was leading inherently to an extreme concentration of wealth, unlike what had been seen before. And so Vladimir Lenin, as someone who had studied Marx and his writings for several decades, was at this point writing in the middle of the Russian Revolution, I believe, if not just after it was completed. And so he was talking in the context of both that revolution as well as World War I that was also essentially kicking off here. So the main points in the book touch on a wide variety of topics, but tie them all together into one cohesive picture of global economics and how it was changing at this point at the turn of the 20th century. So the main ideas are around the concentration of wealth and control of resources into fewer and fewer private hands outside of governments or monarchies or lords or anything like that. How this led to reorganization of the lower classes as well into like laboring wage workers rather than having the old medieval kind of relationships with each other. As well as the role of the, at this point, kind of emergingly dominant banking systems across Europe, and how the control of financial loans and the decision-making around that was essentially letting the banks dictate the company's policies as well, and so that it gave them essentially an inordinate amount of power to these financial interests that have little connection to these industries outside of just wanting to make money from them. And that this is like a very categorical change to even the concentrated kind of resources that had happened in the Middle Ages. And then the other major point is this idea of global imperialism, where when capitalist countries kind of run out of like poor people to exploit, like all of their people are either going to rise up or do something like that, and they don't have factory workers to mistreat anymore, or they just can't pull it off in the same way or as cheap as, people started developing some democratic rights and constitutional monarchies. These countries started exporting their labor very extensively, even beyond what had happened during like the mercantile kind of era, and to where a lot of the bases of mass production for large capitalist economies was at this point starting to move kind of overseas, quote unquote. So he was noting that this was kind of a continuation of the like division of the world by the great powers that was happening in the 1800s as well. And that the conflicts that arose out of this process of kind of acquisition by the different imperial countries is directly the cause of World War I. So, without further ado, we'll get right into the prefaces. There's more than one because he had to release it in multiple countries under multiple publishers, and these different countries had different censorship regulations, and he wanted to contextualize the work differently in each respective country. So, the first is the preface to the Russian edition of the book. So this is, frankly, his most important target audience. The pamphlet here presented to the reader was written in Zurich in the spring of 1916. In the conditions in which I was obliged to work there, I naturally suffered somewhat from a shortage of French and English literature, and from a serious dearth of Russian literature. However, I made use of the principal English work Imperialism, J.A. Hobson's book, with all the care that in my opinion that work deserves. This pamphlet was written with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. Hence, I was not only forced to confine myself strictly to an exclusively theoretical, mainly economical analysis of facts, but to formulate the few necessary observations on politics with extreme caution, by hints, in that Aesopian language, in that cursed Aesopian language to which Tsarism compelled all revolutionaries to have recourse whenever they took up their pens to write a legal work. It is very painful in these days of liberty to read these cramped passages of the pamphlet, crushed as they seem in an iron vise, distorted on account of the censor, of how imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution, of how social chauvinism, socialism in words, chauvinism in deeds, is the utter betrayal of socialism, complete desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie, of how the split in the labor movement is bound up with the objective conditions of imperialism, etc. I had to speak in a slavish tongue, and I must refer the reader who is interested in the question to the volume which is soon to appear, in which are reproduced the articles I wrote abroad in the years 1914 to 17. Special attention must be drawn, however, to a passage on pages 119 to 20, in order to show, in a guise acceptable to the censors, how shamefully the capitalists and the social chauvinists deserters, whom Kautsky opposes with so much inconsistency, lies on the question of annexations, in order to show with what cynicism they screen the annexations of their capitalists. I was forced to quote, as an example, Japan. The careful reader will easily substitute Russia for Japan, and Finland, Poland, Courland, the Ukraine, Khiva, Bokhara, Estonia, or any other regions peopled by non-Great Russians for Korea. I trust this pamphlet will help the reader to understand the fundamental economic question vis-a-vis the question of the economic essence of imperialism. For unless this is studied, it will be impossible to understand and appraise modern war and modern politics. So that's the end of the preface to the Russian edition, and I mean, largely he's just kind of clarifying that, like, hey, I am, a radical revolutionary, and the words that I'm using here are expressing my ideas, but I'm toning down the, hey, let's go do something about it language to a large extent, because I have to. And he also says that essentially he uses examples of other countries that have certain kinds of relationships with their imperial subjects, such as Japan to Korea, with Imperial Russia as well, but he doesn't directly say Imperial Russia in there because he can't publish that kind of thing speaking out against them. So he's telling the reader that, yeah, there's going to be some analogies that you need to think a little bit about because I'm not actually able to talk about Russia as directly in this work. So the preface to the German and French editions is as follows. As was indicated in the preface to the Russian edition, this pamphlet was written in 1916, with an eye to the Tsar's censorship. I am unable to revise the whole text at the present time, nor perhaps is this advisable, since the main purpose of the book was and remains to present on the basis of the summarized returns of irrefutable bourgeois statistics, and the admissions of bourgeois scholars of all countries, a general picture of the world capitalist system in its international relationships at the beginning of the 20th century, on the eve of the First World Imperialist War. To a certain extent, it will be useful for many communists in advanced capitalist countries to convince themselves by the example of this pamphlet, legal, from the standpoint of the Tsarist censor, of the possibility and necessity of making use of even the slight remnants of legality which still remain at the disposal of the communists, say, in contemporary America or France, after the recent wholesale arrests of communists in order to explain the utter falsity of social pacifist views and hopes for world democracy. The most essential of what should be added to this censored pamphlet I shall try to present in this preface. And just to take a second, I think it's extraordinarily interesting that he says First Imperialist World War. He's calling it World War I while World War I is starting. He died well before the beginning of World War II. And so part of the theme is that, he's saying, World War I will repeat itself if this kind of imperialist economic system remains. And, so in the pamphlet, I proved that the war of 1914 to 18 was imperialistic, that is, an annexationist, predatory, plunderous war, on the part of both sides, It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition and repartition of colonies, spheres of influence, of finance capital, etc. Proof of what was the true social, or rather the true class character of the war, is naturally to be found, not in the diplomatic history of the war, but in an analysis of the objective position of the ruling classes in all belligerent countries. In order to depict this objective position, one must not take examples or isolated data. In view of the extreme complexity of social life, it is always quite easy to select any number of examples or separate data to prove any point one desires. But the whole of the data concerning the basis of economic life in all the belligerent countries and the whole world. It is precisely irrefutable summarized data of this kind that I quoted in describing the partition of the world in the period of 1876 to 1914 in Chapter 6, and the distribution of the railways all over the world in the period of 1890 to 1913 in Chapter 7. Railways combine within themselves the basic capitalist industries, coal, iron, and steel, and they are the most striking index of the development of international trade and bourgeois democratic civilization. In the preceding chapters of the book, I showed how the railways are linked up with large-scale industry, with monopolies, syndicates, cartels, trusts, banks, and the financial oligarchy. The uneven distribution of the railways, their uneven development, sums up, as it were, modern world monopolist capitalism, and this summing up proves that imperialist wars are absolutely inevitable under such an economic system, as long as private property in the means of production exists. The building of railways seems to be a simple, natural, democratic, cultural, and civilizing enterprise. That is what it is in the opinion of bourgeois professors, those who are paid to depict capitalist slavery in bright colors, and in the opinion of the petty bourgeois Philistines. But, as a matter of fact, the capitalist threads which in thousands of different intercrossings bind these enterprises with private property in the means of production in general, have converted this work of construction into an instrument for oppressing 1,000 million people in the colonies and semi-colonies, that is, more than half the population of the globe, which inhabits the subject countries, as well as the wage slaves of capitalism in the lands of civilization. Sorry I'm sweating. The AC doesn't reach into this office. I feel like the reverse of Mini Minuteman in his cold barn studio. It's so hot. Private property based on the labor of the small proprietor, free competition, democracy, i.e. all the catchwords with which the capitalists and their press deceive the workers and the peasants, are things of the past. Capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the people of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world marauders, armed to the teeth, America, Great Britain, and Japan, who involve the whole world in their war over the sharing of their booty. The Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, dictated by monarchist Germany, and later on, the much more brutal and despicable Versailles Treaty, dictated by the democratic republics of America and France, and also by Free England, have rendered very good service to humanity by exposing both the hired coolies of the pen of imperialism and the petty bourgeois reactionaries, although they call themselves pacifists and socialists, who sing praise to Wilsonism, who have insisted that peace and reform were possible under imperialism. The tens of millions of dead and maimed left by the war, a war for the purpose of deciding whether the British or German group of financial marauders is to receive the lion's share, and the 2 peace treaties mentioned above, open the eyes of the millions and tens of millions of people who are downtrodden, oppressed, deceived, and duped by the bourgeoisie with unprecedented rapidity. Thus, out of the universal ruin caused by the war, a worldwide revolutionary crisis is arising, which, in spite of the protracted and difficult stages it may have to pass, cannot end in any other way than a proletarian revolution and its victory. The Basel Manifesto of the Second International, which in 1912 gave an appraisal of the war that ultimately broke out in 1914, and not of war in general. There are all kinds of wars, including revolutionary wars. This manifesto is now a monument exposing the shameful bankruptcy and treachery of the heroes of the Second International. That is why I reproduce this manifesto as a supplement to the present edition, and again I call upon the reader to note that the heroes of the Second International are just as assiduously avoiding the passages of this manifesto, which speak precisely, clearly, and definitely of the connection between that impending war and the proletarian revolution, as a thief avoids the place where he has committed a theft. Special attention has been devoted in this pamphlet to a criticism of Kautskyism, the international ideological trend represented in all countries of the world by the prominent theoreticians and leaders of the Second International, Otto Bauer and Company in Austria, Ramsay MacDonald and others in England, Albert Thomas in France, etc., and multitudes of socialists, reformists, pacifists, bourgeois democrats, and parsons. This ideological trend is, on one hand, a product of the disintegration and decay of the Second International, and, on the other hand, it is the inevitable fruit of the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, who by the whole of their conditions of life are held captive to the bourgeois and democratic prejudices. The views held by Kautsky and his like are a complete renunciation of the very revolutionary principles of Marxism, which he championed for decades, especially in his struggle against socialist opportunism. It is not a mere accident, therefore, that the Kautskians all over the world have now united in practical politics with the extreme opportunists through the Yellow or the Second International, and with the bourgeois governments through bourgeois coalition governments in which socialists take part. The growing world proletarian revolutionary movement in general, and the communist movement in particular, demands that the theoretical errors of Kautskyism be analyzed and exposed. The more so, since pacifism and democracy in general, which have no claim to Marxism whatever, but which, like Kautsky and co., are obscuring the profundity of the contradictions of imperialism, and the inevitable revolutionary crisis to which it gives rise, are still very widespread over the world. It is the bounden duty of the party of the proletariat to combat these tendencies and to win away from the bourgeoisie the small proprietors who are duped by them, and the millions of toilers who live in more or less petty bourgeois conditions of life. A few words must be said about Chapter 8, entitled The Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism. As already pointed out in the text, Hilferding, ex-Marxist and now a comrade in arms of Kautsky, is one of the chief exponents and bourgeois reformist policy in the International Social Democratic Party of Germany, has taken a step backward compared with the frankly pacifist and reformist Englishman Hobson on this question. The international split of the whole labor movement is now quite evident, the Second and Third Internationals. Armed struggle and civil war between the two trends is now a recognized fact. The support given to Kolchak and Denikin in Russia by the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries against the Bolsheviks, the fight against the Scheidemans, the Noskis and co., have been conducted in conjunction with the bourgeoisie against the Spartacists in Germany. The same thing in Finland, Poland, Hungary, etc. What is the economic basis of this historically important world phenomenon? Precisely the parasitism and decay of capitalism, which are the characteristic features of its highest historical stage of development, i.e. imperialism. As has been shown in this pamphlet, capitalism has now brought into the front a handful, less than 1/10 of the inhabitants of the globe, less than 1/5 if the most generous and liberal calculations were made, of very rich and very powerful states which plunder the whole world simply by clipping coupons. Capital exports produce an income of 8 to 10 billion francs per annum, according to pre-war prices and pre-war bourgeois statistics. Now, of course, they produce much more than that. Obviously, out of such enormous super profits, since they are obtained over and above the profits which capitalists squeeze out of their workers of the home country, it is quite possible to bribe the labor leaders and the upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. And the capitalists of the advanced countries are bribing them. They bribe them in 1,000 different ways, direct and indirect, overt and covert. This stratum of bourgeoisified workers, or the labor aristocracy, who are quite Philistine in their mode of life, in the size of their earnings and in their outlook, serves as a principal prop of the Second International, and in our days, the principal social, not military prop of the bourgeoisie. They are the real agents of the bourgeoisie in the labor movement, and the labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, the real channels of reformism and chauvinism. In the civil war between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, they inevitably, and in no small numbers, stand by the side with the bourgeoisie, with the Versailles against the Communards. Not the slightest progress can be made toward the solution of the practical problems of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and unless its political and sociological significance is appreciated. Imperialism is the eve of the proletarian social revolution. This has been confirmed since 1917 on a worldwide scale. So wait, one small correction. The book or pamphlet itself was written in 1916, so it was kind of right in the middle of World War I, and then these prefaces were actually written after World War I in 1919, I believe. So, on to the actual main intro of the book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. During the last 15 or 20 years, especially since the Spanish-American War in 1898 and the Anglo-Boer War in 1899 to 1902, the economic and also the political literature of the two hemispheres has more and more often adopted the term imperialism in order to define the present era. In 1902, a book by the English economist J. A. Hobson, Imperialism, was published in London and New York. This author, who adopts the point of view of bourgeois social reformism and pacifism, which in essence is identical with the present point of view of the ex-Marxist, K. Kautsky, gives an excellent and comprehensive description of the principal economic and political characteristics of imperialism. In 1910, there appeared in Vienna the work of the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hilferding, Finance Capital. In spite of the mistake the author commits on the theory of money, and in spite of a certain inclination on his part to reconcile Marxism with opportunism, this work gives us a very valuable theoretical analysis, as its subtitle tells us, of the latest phase of capitalist development. Indeed, what has been said of imperialism during the last few years, especially in a great many magazine and newspaper articles, and also in the resolutions, for example, of the Chemnitz and Basel Congresses, which took place in autumn of 1912, has scarcely gone beyond the ideas put forward, or more exactly, summed up by the two writers mentioned above. Later on, we shall try to show briefly, and as simply as possible, the connection and relationships between the principal economic features of imperialism. We shall not be able to deal with non-economic aspects of the question, however much they deserve to be dealt with. We have to put references to literature and other notes, which perhaps would not interest all readers at the end of this pamphlet. The enormous growth of industry. There is a footnote here that by non-economic, he specifically means political. He does talk about social dynamics in the book. So I think this does get across partly his tone and kind of what makes this book so interesting and entertaining. You have someone writing in the 1910s who is a political revolutionary actively. He's very attitudinal, he's very snarky with kind of trying to diss his political opponents and rivals in the work while writing very complex economic analysis. And I think that it is very compelling for a lot of those reasons. But yeah, that was the prefaces for Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, as well as the intro. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more context for the chapters themselves, and I'll be out with Chapter 3 very soon. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Reese's Side Quests for more book reviews, travel, coins, memes, animals, anything else.